One of the things I learned in his comments this afternoon is that the foreword is regarded by many, including congressmen. About half of Congress subscribes to the foreword, as well as many of the major newspapers in the U.S. and other media outlets regard the foreword as the honest voice of the Jewish community. I also learned something else that was interesting and maybe not surprising, that the newspaper over the years, especially since the beginning of its English language edition in 1990, has made plenty of enemies on the left, on the right, and probably also on the center, I would imagine. And I think these two things go together, because if you're going to be an honest newspaper and do honest reporting of the American Jewish community, both its good and its bad, if you're not making enemies somewhere, sometime, with every issue, you may not be doing your job. You'll probably hear a little bit more about this perhaps tonight in the talk, but I thought it was great to hear that one of your recent enemies, or maybe not so recent, is Elliot Spitzer of New York. Another recent enemy is Arthur Waskow. So people on all sides of the political spectrum. Also recently, I happened to be in a conversation with some American Jewish writers. I was in New York just last week, including one quite prominent American Jewish writer. And two of the people that I was spending some time with in New York both said to me independently, the most important place, if you're a Jewish author, to have your book reviewed is in the foreword. And I know for myself, living here in a kind of outpost of world Jewry, we're far from the center of the action, that I have depended on the foreword ever since, I don't read Yiddish, so ever since the introduction of its English language edition, for my information about what books I should be reading, what films I should be seeing, and not only what books and films and orchestras I should be hearing, seeing, listening to, but what we should be bringing to Asheville so that we will be connected to the larger Jewish world. And it's with that in mind that I could think of nobody better than J.J. Goldberg to kick off our 25th anniversary celebration, who really kind of represents one of the hearts of the American Jewish world and really represents one of the minds of the American Jewish world. J.J. Goldberg is now the editorial director of The Forward. He's an award-winning journalist, author, and lecturer, having covered the politics and culture of the Middle East and the Jewish world for more than 2 decades. He has previously been a correspondent for the Jerusalem Report. He contributes articles to the New York Times, and he's also been the author of a very well-received and highly regarded book called Jewish Power Inside the American Jewish Establishment. We're very fortunate to have J.J. Goldberg with us this evening. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to J.J. Goldberg.
Well, thank you. I have to say I've driven through North Carolina a couple of times on my way to Miami. I've flown over it to conventions in Atlanta. But my father went to Chapel Hill for some reason in the 40s. He's actually president of Hillel in his senior year. My sister then went to Greensboro. And my 10-year-old son, for some reason, became a Panthers fan, which was very difficult last week when he was watching the Super Bowl and all of his friends were delirious and he was sitting in a corner sulking. But I feel like Oh, here we go. Can you hear better now? I feel as though there's something very familiar about being here. Maybe it's being so close to Doc Watson's home. I'm here to talk about the Israel lobby and how it's impacting on the image of Jews in America and on the sense of security of Jews in America. You may have heard, I'm sure you've probably heard more than you want to hear, about a book that came out last fall called The Israel Lobby, An American Foreign Policy, by a pair of professors from Harvard and the University of Chicago, Stephen Walt, who was the academic dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard, the Kennedy School of Government, and John Mearsheimer, who's one of the most distinguished foreign policy scholars at the University of Chicago. These are two giants in the field of international relations. They wrote an article a year earlier. This would be, now it's probably 2 years ago, in March of '06, called The Israel Lobby. It was published in the London Review of Books and circulated here on the internet. It became quite a cause célèbre because the authors said it couldn't be published in America. It was 80 pages with footnotes, essentially saying that the pro-Israel lobby is a large force that works its way through American society and distorts American foreign policy in order to benefit Israel at the expense of America and its international image. It was quite shocking. The beginning of it was their complaint that they couldn't publish the article in America because they wouldn't let it be published. The Israel lobby, controls publishing, and everybody's scared of it. It turns out that they had been commissioned by The Atlantic Monthly to write an article. They wrote a hugely long article that even The Atlantic couldn't have published, and it was very tendentious in ways that I'll tell you in a moment. And so rather than look for another publisher, they published it in London, where there's a more sympathetic audience. And by the way, it was simultaneously posted as a working paper on the Harvard University website. So it's not like they couldn't get their word out, but they made a lot of hay out of being a persecuted pair, and the article became a cause célèbre. What did it say? First of all, they insisted they were not anti-Israel. They recognize and accept Israel's right to exist. They care for its welfare. It's just that, to begin with, Israel was created through an act of genocide by displacing a people from their home. And this is what they wrote. That it was ethnic cleansing and mass murder and mass rape and a whole lot of other things, setting you up to believe that Israel is fundamentally an immoral fact. They said that the Israel lobby is a loose association of organizations, individuals, and public institutions that works for the benefit of Israel at the expense of America, that has twisted and perverted American foreign policy so that Israel can pursue its expansionist aims of taking over neighboring countries and driving out their citizens while Americans pay in blood. But they have nothing against Israel. Their definition of this lobby is supporters of Israel, people who promote Israel, who spend a significant time of each day devoting themselves to advancing the interests of Israel. Organizations in Washington like AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is an organization mainly made up of American Jews that's registered as a lobby in Washington to lobby on behalf of the American-Israel relationship. They're quite right about it. It is there in order to lobby for the strengthening of America's relationship with Israel. They included, for example, the New York Times, which is generally sympathetic to Israel. They included the major news networks on television. They included thousands. They said it's not all American Jews, because there are American Jews who are opposed to Israel, such as Jewish Voices for Peace, which is a tiny group mainly in San Francisco that thinks Israel is all the things they said it was. In other words, no more than about 3/4, maybe 85% of American Jews support Israel's right to exist and defend itself. So they're obviously not talking about all American Jews, just the overwhelming majority. They got a tremendous amount of sympathy from liberals, progressives, iconoclasts, from left-wing journalists, places like The Nation magazine, from National Public Radio. Everybody was talking about Mearsheimer and Walt and how these two distinguished scholars couldn't get the word out. Walt, by the way, was shortly thereafter removed as academic dean of the Kennedy School. He's still a professor, but he's no longer the dean of the most distinguished school of political science in America. So that's more of the evidence that these guys are persecuted. There was a forum in New York, a public forum, a few months after the book was published. The paper was published before the book, in which there was a debate between advocates of the Israel lobby, people who were accused in their paper of being members of the Israel lobby, and Mearsheimer, Rashid Khalidi, who's a Palestinian-American professor of Middle East Studies at Columbia, and Tony Judt, who's a professor of international affairs at NYU, and had published a piece 2 years earlier in the New York Review of Books saying it may be that Israel shouldn't exist. He didn't say Israel shouldn't exist. He said in some ways it's plausible. I'll get into Tony Judt later. But these were the two sides of the debate. I talked to Rashid Khalidi and Tony Judt after. By the way, the other side was Aaron Miller, Dennis Ross. Am I right? No, Martin Indyk, former American ambassador to Israel, Dennis Ross, former State Department peace negotiator, and Shlomo Ben-Ami, who's a former Israeli foreign minister, all of whom are strong advocates of Israeli-Palestinian peace and compromise. But in these guys' view, they're part of the Israel lobby fighting to maintain Israel's stranglehold over the territories. The debate went on. Afterwards, Mearsheimer held a little press conference. By the way, it was a shouting match in the audience, back and forth. About half the audience was for the Walt Mearsheimer point of view, and half the audience was for Israel. And afterwards, Mearsheimer held a small press conference together with Khalidi and Judt. And I went there and I watched, and one of the reporters asked Mearsheimer, isn't it true that American policy toward Israel has varied under different presidents? That, for example, the Clinton administration was much more active in promoting Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation, as opposed to the Bush administration, which was solidly behind Israel, let it do anything it wanted, and might justifiably be called aggressive toward the Arabs. And Mearsheimer said, well, no, there's really no difference between the two, because if you look at them, who made Middle East policy in the Clinton administration? Dennis Ross, Aaron Miller, Dan Kurtzer, Martin Indyk. Who's making Middle East policy in the Bush administration? It's Elliott Abrams, Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith. He said, and when you think about it, all of them are pro-Israel. He was trying to think of a common denominator among them, and he almost said Jewish. But he's not an anti-Semite. Now, lumping AIPAC, which essentially argues that whatever Israel does is legitimate and should be supported, with the New York Times, which is constantly critical of Israel, is bizarre. It betrays a complete lack of thinking. They also argued that the leaders of the pro-Israel lobby, most of whom follow the neoconservative ideology, had pushed America into a war in Iraq that America otherwise would not have fought in order to remove an enemy of Israel. They didn't invent that idea. That idea started getting popular right around the time that the war began. The war began in March of '03, and they started being articles published, first in the alternative press, saying this was being whipped up by pro-Israel Jewish neocons in the Bush administration, like Richard Pearl especially, and Douglas Feith, and Paul Wolfowitz, in order to protect Israel, and that America never would have gone to war if it weren't for this pressure from Israel and its lobbyists in this country. In their book, which came out a year later with a $750,000 advance from Farrar Straus, was it? The authors point out that Israel wasn't even unanimous in favor of this war. For example, in the spring of 2002, the Israeli defense minister, Benjamin Ben-Eliezer, argued that a war in Iraq would be bad for Israel. Generally speaking, I've since found out most official level Israelis were against the war. I have been told by people both in the American government and the Israeli government that in the meeting between Sharon and Bush at the White House a year before the war, Sharon tried to convince Bush not to go to war against Iraq. The Israelis had learned shortly after 9/11 that Bush had decided to go to war against Iraq. I mean, he claimed that he didn't decide until the spring of 2003, but they found out in January of 2002 that it was decided. And that's when Sharon went to Washington and told Bush, it's a bad idea. If you go and remove Saddam Hussein, Iraq will fall into chaos, the Shiite majority will come to power, and Iraq will become a superpower with nobody to stand up to it. Bush didn't listen. Iran. Bush didn't listen. So the talk about this being Israel's war and the Jews or the Jewish lobby or the Israel lobby pushing America into it to advance Israel's interests got louder and louder, so that by the spring of 2003, you're hearing it from major public intellectuals like Michael Lind, former neoconservative, had been at the Hudson Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, and then publicly broke with neoconservatism and has written several books on liberal perspectives on American policy. He wrote an article in one of the British magazines in 2003, again arguing that the Jewish lobby, led by people like Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl, had pushed America into war, and America never would have gone to war if it hadn't been for that. And Bush and Cheney had been bamboozled into this whole thing. In 2004, Senator Ernest Hollings said the same thing on the floor of the Senate. He was attacked by Jewish activists, by Jewish organizations, by some Jewish journalists, and he got up 2 weeks later and said, you can't talk me out of this. They want to suppress things. You're not allowed to say things in this town that AIPAC doesn't want you to say, but I'm going to say it. It was a war cooked up by the Jewish lobby, and American boys are dying. 2 weeks after that, Anthony Zinni, a major general in the American Marines, recently retired, who had been the chief of the Central Command, which is the Middle East theater of the American military, and after that had been the American Middle East negotiator under Bush, I believe. Zinni gave an interview on 60 Minutes, I think, and he said the same thing, that everybody knows, it's the worst kept secret in this town, that it was the neoconservatives and the pro-Israel lobby who had cooked up this war, and you can't say anything in this town that that lobby doesn't want you to say. All right, he's on 60 Minutes saying it, but somehow you can't say it. So there's been since, I suppose, building since 9/11, intensely since 2003, since the war began, a growing atmosphere in the American media and the American public, and by the way, on the American campus, that there's a large and powerful pro-Israel lobby that threatens Americans' interests, that is bad for America. Now, if you think that that sounds like a veiled version of the old anti-Semitism from the 1930s and so on, I would guess that you're right. I couldn't prove it. But it certainly is a chilling thing to hear that the people who advocate on Israel's behalf in this country are a danger to America, because everybody knows that the people who advocate on Israel's behalf in this country are mostly the Jewish community. They're saying that this small minority has too much power and threatens America. It's an old claim. It's been said many times before, but it hadn't been said in a long time. We talk a lot about Franklin Roosevelt and how he wouldn't let He wouldn't save the Jews. He wouldn't bomb the concentration camps. He wouldn't let Jews into America, wouldn't lift the visa regulations in order to admit Jewish refugees above the quotas. In fact, the public opinion polls during World War II showed consistently, 1938 all the way through 1945. Gallup took polls every month, and they would ask frequently, do you think Jews are too powerful in this country? And consistently, 75% said yes. Do you think Jews are a threat to this country? 25 to 28%, year after year, said yes, Jews are a threat to this country. When Senator Wagner from New York in 1938 tried to introduce a bill in the Senate Judiciary Committee to lift visa regulations and quotas in order to bring 20,000 Jewish children from Germany and Austria and put them up in Quaker homes to get them out of the war zone, somebody testified, the head of the American Legion, to the Senate Judiciary Committee, gentlemen, this is not a refugee bill, it's not a human rights bill, it's a Jewish bill. And the Senate voted it down. There were 63 other bills in Congress at that time to tighten regulations, and many of them passed, to tighten immigration controls in order to allow fewer Jews into the country. In November of 1942, a few months after America entered the war, the World Jewish Congress in Geneva confirmed that, in fact, the Nazis had set up death camps and were planning on exterminating the Jews of Europe. Nobody knew at the time. Hitler had talked about it, but everybody thought he was exaggerating. It turned out that they were actually incinerating, exterminating Jews, and they intended to kill all 9 million Jews in Europe. He wired it to Stephen Wise, the president of the American Jewish Congress, who was friendly with Roosevelt, who went to see Roosevelt immediately. Roosevelt authorized him to issue a statement in his name, deploring, he said, I can't do it, deploring the German policy and saying it would only make the Germans sorry when the war was over, when they could do something about it. 2 weeks after that, December of 1942, Roosevelt sent a bill to Congress in which he asked for the president to have the right to waive immigration rules in individual cases. The idea was to be able to move prisoners of war and spies across the border without going through the visa process every time. Members of Congress got up and said, this is a secret plan to save the Jews. And it got voted down overwhelmingly because Congress was opposed to the idea of saving Jews. And all the way through December of 1945, 6 months after the war in Europe was over, Gallup was still finding 75% of America thought Jews had too much power, and 25% of America thought Jews were a threat. Now, people talk a lot also about how nobody ever discussed the Holocaust until the 60s, the 70s. It was the best kept secret. First of all, Anne Frank was a bestseller worldwide in 1954. And the movie about Anne Frank won an Oscar in 1959. And before that, in 1947, John Hersey wrote a book called The Wall about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 6 months. People talked about the Holocaust. There were newsreels. I've seen them in old grainy footage of General Eisenhower walking through the death camps right after they'd liberated them, looking at the ovens and the piles of bodies and shaking his head. Everybody knew about it. By the end of June, everybody knew about it. It was on all their movie screens. And in December, people were still saying, Jews have too much power, Jews are a threat. Now, 10 years later, by 1955, 20 to 25% of America thought Jews had too much power, and 5% thought Jews were a threat. Something happened between 1945 and 1955 that utterly changed the way Americans look at Jews. Discrimination, bigotry became taboo. The very idea of, well, first of all, in the fall of 1945, the American Jewish Congress and the NAACP got together, and they pushed a bill through the New York State legislature making it illegal for colleges to discriminate on the basis of race or religion. That had never happened before in America. It was legal and admirable as late as 1940 for people to put ads in the newspaper saying Christians only whites only. Nobody thought a thing about it. The head of Dartmouth came to New York and was interviewed by the New York Post, which was then a left-wing Jewish-owned newspaper, to defend the idea of quotas to keep out Jews in 1945. And in 1955, you couldn't say that. And Anne Frank was a bestseller. And The Wall was a bestseller. Somehow the Holocaust had seeped through. Somehow the civil rights movement and Brown versus the Board of Education was making a difference. The soldiers who came back from the war saying, we fought for democracy, where is it? There was a process that happened so that by 1960, it was taboo to say things like that, even if you thought it. In 1942, Roosevelt had to pretend that he wasn't helping Jews because otherwise he would lose the public. By 1990, Louis Farragut had to pretend he didn't hate Jews. Remember, he gave a concert where he played Mendelssohn to show that he loved Jews. He didn't, but he had to pretend that he did, or that he didn't dislike Jews, because by 1970, 1980, and 1990, the opposite had changed. America had turned around. And by 1955 and 1960, America's most admired authors were Bernard Malamud, Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, let's go on, Woody Allen, Barbra Streisand. In the 1990s, Jerry Seinfeld, for 5 years, was the most admired person in America. I'll tell you more than that. His show was the #1 show on TV. What was it? It was a show about a bunch of Jewish people sitting around in New York fetching to each other. He actually was forced, he and Larry David were forced by NBC to make 2 of the characters non-Jews. George became George Costanza, so that you have an Italian name, and Elaine was given lines from time to time, I'm not of your faith, in order to establish that not all of the people were Jews, but nobody believed it. Nobody believed for a minute that they weren't for, and it became fashionable. What was The Single Guy with Jonathan Silverman? What's her face? Brooke Shields had a show for a while. Caroline in the City. There was a whole series, Friends, where a bunch of friends sit around in a New York apartment, some Jews and some non-Jews, fetching. And America wanted them in their living rooms. And for 5 years, as I say, Seinfeld was the #1 show, and there's something called the Q factor that they use in television. It's the science of determining how hot, how warm a personality is. To Americans, it's an intimate medium. Do you want to sit next to that person for the evening? And Jerry Seinfeld was the person that Americans wanted to sit with. Americans, what's the biggest crisis in Jewish life? The guy who want to marry us. American Jews and American Christians have grown together in many, many ways. Bill Clinton, in his first cabinet in 1993, 14 cabinet secretaries, 4 of them were Jewish. There's 2 Jews on the Supreme Court. There's 13 Jews in the Senate out of 100. I think it's 11 of the 50 Democrats in the Senate. 11 out of 50 Democrats in the Senate are Jewish. Jews have been accepted until 2001. And now we're in big trouble. And I would say it's big trouble. What has changed? For one thing, America is deeply involved in the Middle East, and the Middle East has come back to bite us. America. The Arab world, the Palestinian national movement, has gotten more and more intense, but it didn't happen all at once. Remember that in 1988, the PLO had a meeting of its National Council in Algiers and accepted the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. For the first time, they officially recognized Israel. 5 years after that, a secret agreement was reached in Oslo. Rabin and Arafat flew to the White House to shake hands, and everybody thought there was going to be peace. Everybody thought there was going to be peace. Not everybody was happy about it. A month after the Oslo agreement, there was a meeting of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and they were adopting a resolution making it legal for American officials to meet with PLO officials. You remember it had been made illegal in 1988. a bill that had been introduced by Joe Lieberman his first year in the Senate, made it illegal for American officials to meet with terrorist organizations. And now America was brokering a peace process between Israel and the PLO, and they couldn't broker it and move it along if they couldn't meet with the PLO. So a bill was introduced in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and Chuck Schumer from Brooklyn, congressman from Brooklyn, from the south end of Brooklyn, which is it's very heavily Jewish and very heavily Orthodox, said he was going to vote against it. Howard Berman from the west side of Los Angeles, which is also Jewish but not the same kind of Jews, asked Schumer to come out in the hallway. He got out in the hallway and he said, "What the hell are you doing? You're sticking a wheel in the spokes of peace, a stick in the wheel of peace." Schumer said, "I got to do this. This is my voters." Now, Peter Deutsch from South Florida, from Fort Lauderdale, had come out with them, and Elsie Hastings, who was a black representative from Palm Beach County, and represented, in other words, the 4 members of Congress representing the 4 biggest Jewish communities in America, had a meeting in the hallway to decide what to do about the PLO. And they finally reached a deal where it would be introduced to the House. Schumer wouldn't stop it. He was going to get outvoted on the committee anyway, and he would agree that it be adopted in the House by a voice vote. That way, nobody had to raise their hand, and Jewish voters wouldn't see who had just voted for Arafat. Because Israel could meet with Arafat. The American government could help it meet with Arafat, but American Jewish voters were going to punish the people who did it, including Chuck Schumer. He didn't want to lose his seat. In fact, the Zionist Organization of America, which happens to be very, very conservative, very hawkish, it's aligned with the right wing of the Likud in Israel, and was totally opposed to the Oslo Agreement, introduced a bill in the Senate the following spring of 1994, saying, they had set up a peace accord and monitoring group in the winter of '94. Peace accord. They asked a bunch of Congress people to join an outside group of Congress members that would monitor Arafat's violations of the agreement. And then they got a bill passed that to the extent that the PLO violated it, there wouldn't be aid. It never actually happened, but the point of the monitoring group was not to find out whether Israel was violating the agreement, which it did just as much as the Palestinians. It was to find out whether the Palestinians were monitoring. Now, a friend of mine who now works for Peace Now was then working as a foreign affairs aide to Nita Lowey, a Jewish congresswoman from Westchester, who was one of the most outspoken advocates of Israel and was a very liberal Democrat. And I called my friend. I said, "Why did you let Nita Lowey join this monitoring group? I mean, it's obviously intended to slow down the peace process." He said, "I didn't let her join it. I made her join it." I said, "Why? You're a big peace advocate." He said, if she doesn't join it, Rabbi Schoenfeld from a very Orthodox section of Queens would have pickets outside her house every day. If she does join it, who's going to picket against her? Some lawyers from Scarsdale? Now, the fact is that the most active members of the Jewish community are the most opposed to Israel giving up any territory because they believe it's territory that God promised. The less you believe that God promised Israel that territory, big secret, the less likely you are to be involved in the Jewish community. If you're an Orthodox Jew in Brooklyn, you will vote for the person who's strongest on Israel, Democrat or Republican. They went heavily for Al Gore in '88 because they were against George Bush. Heavily for Al Gore. Al Gore wiped the floor. In '92, George Bush got 15% of the Jewish vote in New York. He lost, obviously, but that wasn't because of the Jews in New York. Partly. Al D'Amato, Republican senator from New York running for re-election on the same ticket as Bush, got 40% of the Jews in New York. 25% of the Jews in New York voted for Clinton and D'Amato. They went like this and like that. Why? Because D'Amato was well known as a friend of the Jews, and the head of his ticket, Bush, was known as an enemy of the Jews, of Israel, not friendly toward Israel. So D'Amato got 250,000 votes strictly because of his views on Israel, or almost entirely because of his views on Israel. 250,000 votes. And by the way, he won by 100,000 against an Orthodox Jew because it was about Israel. That's a small percentage of the Jewish community. But there's 4 million Jewish votes in this country, maybe 5. And if 25% of the Jew, or even 20%, will change votes based on how Israel goes, that's almost 1 million votes. Nixon won by 540,000 votes. The Republicans had gotten 10% of the Jewish vote when Goldwater ran in '64. They got 17% of the Jewish vote under Nixon in '68. They worked hard for it, and they got it. They got an extra 7%. That was an extra 500,000. Nixon won by 500,000, and he appointed the first Jewish Secretary of State. These things work. Politics is real. Now let's get back to the Israel lobby. One of the reasons, I've been told this by Israeli generals, numerous Israeli generals, who view the peace process as sacred, who look at Egypt, which has an unguarded border with Israel because they're at peace, as the model. I mean, it's a cold peace. Egyptians don't like Israel. It doesn't matter. Israel saves millions of dollars a year because they can shift soldiers from the Egyptian front to the Syrian front where they are afraid, because the Egyptians are at peace with Israel. It really means something. And they want a peace deal with the Palestinians, not because the Palestinians like Israel, mainly because they don't. They don't want Israelis living in and among the Palestinians because they're unfriendly. And it just gets worse and worse. How did that happen, that Egypt was ready to make peace, that the PLO recognized Israel, that the Saudi Arabia is now floating peace plans that guarantee Israel's right to exist? The Israeli intelligence analysis is this. Beginning in the 1970s, the Jewish lobby, which had become very powerful in Washington because of its role in the civil rights movement in the 60s and immigration reform and religious freedom activism, it was a major player in Washington. After '67, it switched most of its attention to Israel, and it lobbied for what they called no daylight. There should be no daylight visible between the American position and the Israeli position. America should say what Israel says. They got $2 million a year, and then $1 billion, and then $3 billion. Israel is 0.1% of the world's population. It got 20% of American foreign aid. Now, when Israel is a feisty little democratic outpost in the Middle Eastern desert in 1955, the Arabs can talk about wiping it out, driving it into the sea. When Israel has America behind it, spending billions of dollars a year, because Americans don't throw their money around that easily. If America's putting down $3 billion a year, America's not going to let Israel go down, and the Arabs better cut the best deal they can. They don't like it, but they recognize reality. And so they've been trying to cut a deal with Israel, bit by bit, softening their line until '93. And then in '94, Jordan signed a peace agreement. Mauritania signed a peace agreement. There are 7 Arab countries that have delegations, either trade delegations or interest sections, some form of diplomatic relations with Israel. When the Arab League meets, 22 delegations, there are 3 countries that have no relations with Israel, meaning their diplomats don't talk to each other. Well, before the war, it was Iraq, Libya, and Sudan, I believe. All of the other Arab countries at least began meeting with Israel and talking to Israel, even if they didn't open offices. And now the Arab League is unanimously in favor of a peace deal in which Israel withdraws and the Arabs set up embassies in Tel Aviv. That's what the Saudi agreement. It's not a deal that Israel likes. It asks too much of Israel, and it's not enough gradualization and testing of intentions and so on. Israel's got very many complaints about it, but Israel now recognizes it's a big step towards Israel. All of a sudden, in the summer of 2000, Arafat meets with Ehud Barak, the Israeli prime minister, and Bill Clinton in Camp David. The talks blow up. The Palestinians start rioting. Terrorist deaths in Israel, which had been actually from 1996 to 2000, it was 0 per year. There were no deaths from Arab terrorism. They were declined from about 6 per month before the Oslo Agreement to, I think, 5 and then 4 and then 0 for 3 years running. And then all of a sudden, they're 12 a month. And then Sharon becomes prime minister, starts hitting back really hard, and now there's 26 Israelis a month getting blown up. And Israelis are getting madder and madder. Do they think we're doing something wrong? The harder we hit them, the harder they hit us? No, they don't think that. They think we have to show them who's boss. So they hit harder and harder. Terrorism goes up and up and up. Sharon wises up in 2003 and says, we got to get out of here. We cannot go on like this. And all of a sudden, the terrorism stops. The bombing in Dimona this week, the suicide bombing, was the first suicide bombing by Hamas in Israel since 2004. No, I'm sorry, yeah, late 2004. It's 3 and something years that Hamas has not launched and carried out a suicide bombing in Israel. Now, Israelis know all this. They are looking for a way. The government that's now in office was elected on a policy of getting out of the West Bank. The intelligence services have been in favor of a peace deal with the Palestinians since 1988. The government doesn't always listen because of the politicians, but that's been Israel's position. First strategically and since 93 politically, to make a deal with the Palestinians and let them have a state. It was a tough negotiation, but it blew up. They were this far apart, by the way, and it blew up. And now they are very mad at the Palestinians, and they don't believe there can be a deal, so they won't make concessions toward the Palestinians along the way. And the Palestinians want concessions before they can talk to their people because they're mad as hell because thousands have been killed in the last 5 years. 2000 to 2007, which is 8 years, 7 years. And another thing has happened. There's a rage throughout the Arab world. It has been satellite TV, Al Jazeera, the satellite television network, that's the first independent, non-government censored television station in the Arab world. Runs out of Dubai, which is one of the most westernized and liberalized Arab countries. It's a little pocket next to Saudi Arabia. And it's very democratic. And Israel is democratic, so it lets Al Jazeera cameramen wander around Israel and the West Bank. Wherever Israeli reporters can go, Al Jazeera reporters can go. And they were filming Israeli tanks shooting Palestinian kids throwing rocks. And that makes a lot of Arabs very mad, and it's in their living room every night. Do they hammer it home? Yeah. Do they explain why the Israelis were shooting? No. But it's on TV. The Arabs get madder and madder. And one more thing has happened in the last 8 or 9 years. Fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, the idea that life is a zero-sum game, the idea that you don't compromise with evil, you never cooperate with evil, you don't negotiate with evil. It's funny, in 94, New York State elected a governor, Pataki, a Republican, who had very strong support from the Orthodox Jewish community. One of the first things he did was to appoint a state commissioner of community relations in charge of intergroup relations and harmony, who was a former member of the Jewish Defense League, a very strong supporter of the Jewish settlements in the West Bank. This is a person who doesn't believe conflicts should be resolved. She believes conflicts should be won. Those are two opposite beliefs, and in fact, one could call them the two warring ideologies in the world today: resolving conflicts and winning them. Do you cut a deal that makes everybody happy, or do you fight till the end to make the other guy unhappy because he's evil? The idea of winning conflicts, of good versus evil, of right and wrong, of black and white, has spread throughout the world in the last 8 or 9 years. And it's not only in the Arab world where Hamas is winning and Al-Qaeda is suddenly very popular, where religious fundament. By the way, the Bush administration went to introduce democracy in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Palestine in the Palestinian elections. In Egypt, they've been pressuring. Every place there's democratic elections, religious fundamentalists get elected. Now, I wouldn't say this out loud to most people, but I don't understand why anybody who's in favor of Israel is in favor of pushing democracy in the Arab world. If they get it, fine, that's their business. But to advocate that people who want Israel dead come to power, that I don't get. But of course, the idea is people naturally would love Israel if they weren't had their heads twisted by dictators and evil people. I'm quoting them, that's not me. So, the spread of fundamentalism through the Arab world, through the Muslim world, over in recent years, and by the way, the spread of fundamentalism in America. A government and one of the two parties that is absolutely in favor of black and white, right and wrong, demonizing and destroying their enemies. Fundamentalism in the Jewish community, the ultra-Orthodox, the black hat community in Israel, has its own school system. They never go in the army. The rabbis don't allow young men to go in the army. Most of them don't work because they believe they should spend full time studying Torah, and the government pays them. There's a welfare system. If you're in a yeshiva full time, the government pays you a minimum wage. So they don't go in the army, they don't work, they don't pay taxes, and their schools do not teach democracy or civics or history or literature. They teach Torah. Now, when Ben-Gurion made that deal with the rabbis in 1950, there was 500 young men being excused from the army every year. This year, it was 11% of the 18-year-olds. The fertility rate, I believe, is 7 or 8% per woman. And this year's entering kindergarten, which will be, in 12 years, the entering army ranks, was 25% ultra-Orthodox. In 12 years, Israel will have a class of high school graduates which is majority Arab or ultra-Orthodox. Only 50% will be candidates to go in the army. Who's going to defend the country? Fundamentalism is spreading throughout, and by the way, it's in India now. Hindu fundamentalists got elected and pushed out the Gandhi family. The Bharati, I don't remember the rest of it. It's Hindu fundamentalists. There's rioting all the time now between Hindus and Muslims in India, which used to be a secular country. So there's an atmosphere in the world that is just incendiary, and it makes it much more difficult. In this atmosphere, while the PLO and the Egyptian government and the Saudi government are trying to keep a lid on things, popular opinion in the Muslim world is more and more worked up, not about whether Israel is persecuting the Arabs, but about whether Israel should exist. It's an offense against Islam. It takes part of the Holy Land and gives it to a non-Islamic religion. That's actually a violation of the Islamic faith. They got used to Spain. That was 500 years ago. But this is immediate. By the way, Al-Qaeda, bin Laden wants Spain back. It's serious. He gives speeches about it. So it is a thorn. Most of the Arab leadership is fairly pragmatist. They got used to it and they know they can't win. But the Arab leadership is fighting for its life now against the street, which is filled with the same sort of fervor that voters in Kansas are, I guess. It's incendiary. It is relentless. And did I mention that Europe is now 5% Muslim? And growing? Did I mention that there is a growing Muslim population in America? In Europe, if you want to discuss the Middle East and you're a journalist, you want to give all sides a fair hearing. It used to be that all sides meant, does Israel do everything right, or do they do some things wrong? Should Israel compromise or not? Now it's, should Israel exist or not? Because that's the public discussion. That's the public discussion now in America. People are complaining that they can't get their view across. I just heard from one of the students on campus today that, and you have heard it before, the American press is widely regarded as anti-Arab and pro-Israel. Most American Jews, according to surveys, regard the American press as anti-Israel. They're constantly printing criticisms of Israel. They show pictures of Israeli tanks shooting Arab kids. I mean, they do. So the picture's not inaccurate. But it makes people hostile toward it. It makes people question Israel. It opens up daylight, which threatens Israel's existence in our minds. On the pro-Arab side, The American press is anti-Arab and pro-Israel because it fundamentally accepts Israel's right to exist. Israel is a legitimate state. When people try and expel it from the UN, it's considered an outrage. That is regarded as pro-Israel. That's what Walt and Mearsheimer say when they talk about these millions of people who advocate for Israel against America, meaning they support Israel's right to exist. It's a very divided argument. And by the way, as I said, the people on the pro-Israel side generally and more every year are the people who think Israel can never do anything wrong and shouldn't compromise. So on one side, you have people arguing Israel shouldn't exist. And on the other side, you have people arguing there shouldn't be a Palestinian state and the Arabs are essentially evil. There is no middle ground anymore. It's disappearing. Most American Jews think the Palestinians have a right to a state. The people who lobby in Washington for the American Jewish community generally lobby against Israeli compromise. It works, by the way. Also in '93, in the fall, after the Israelis and the Palestinians apparently made peace, people from local Jewish communities started calling up the Canada-Israel Committee and the Israeli embassy in Ottawa, saying there's local Arab groups that want to hold peace celebrations with us. How do we do it? What are the guidelines? And they got suggestions. And when local groups in America started calling AIPAC and the Israeli embassy, they were told, don't meet with them. It's too soon. The conflict has moved from the battlefield to the negotiating table. It's still a conflict. Why was Israel giving a different message in Canada than in America? Because what Jews in Canada say doesn't affect Ottawa, and what Ottawa says doesn't affect the Middle East. What Jews in America say affects Washington, and what Washington says affects the Middle East. So even though Israelis have a wide diversity of views, the leadership essentially doesn't want American Jews to have that diversity because they need American Jews terrified, so they will pressure Washington. And it goes on over and over. And then Israelis, like my friend the general, come here and they go to an AIPAC meeting and go, why is everybody so right-wing here? I don't get it. You should get it. It's a very difficult atmosphere to be in. It's partly difficult because, as I say, the people most involved tend to be the most hawkish. And the people who are the least involved are getting less involved. Young people are just walking away from the whole thing. I don't even want to know about it. That's their attitude. We get pressure all the time from younger readers. Stop talking about Israel. We're not interested. Write about Jewish stuff. Klezmer festivals. New forms of prayer. Israel is boring. And they're always fighting with each other. Get away from it. And so they leave the field to the right. And so it becomes more polarized. I want to tell you two more stories and I'm done. There's an email campaign going on, you might have heard about it, about Barack Obama. I've gotten a bunch of them over the last year. Barack Obama is secretly a Muslim. He was raised as a Muslim. His father was a Muslim. His stepfather was a Muslim. His middle age is Hussein, his middle name. He's got a bunch of anti-Israel advisors on his campaign team, and he's running for president as a sort of Manchurian candidate in order to do in Israel. The Obama campaign has reacted, this is completely absurd. It's a total lie. He was never a Muslim. This started a year ago, January of '07, when the emails started appearing. And in late January of '07, the Obama campaign issued an official statement, Barack Obama was never a Muslim. In March, the LA Times sent reporters to Indonesia, where he was raised for a number of years, and discovered, well, in fact, he was registered in school as a Muslim. So to say he was never a Muslim categorically is not exactly true. He may not have thought about Islam at home, but he was going to a Muslim school where he was registered as a Muslim. Now, his friends will tell you, and it may be accurate, that the school he went to was a public school in a mostly Muslim country. And unlike Egypt or Saudi Arabia, Indonesia is not an Islamic country. The schools are, in fact, secular. They give equal time to Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, even though the country is 90% Muslim. So technically, he didn't go to a Muslim school. In his autobiography, what is it, Stories from My Father, Dreams of My Father, he says, I went to a Muslim school. I spent the last 2 weeks on the phone with the Obama campaign. They're screaming at me because I wrote in an editorial, was he ever a Muslim? Almost certainly yes. Almost certainly, because it depends on how you define was he a Muslim. Was he recognized by the Indonesian government as a Muslim? Yes. Did he believe in Islam? Probably not. I believe him when he said. They're furious at me. I was writing an editorial that said the rumors are ridiculous. And I was writing it because many Jews are believing it. You get it on the street, I get it in shul. And the Obama campaign has these stupid responses. And the Obama campaign is just like liberals for the last 15 or 20 years. They don't know how to answer. The swift boating of Kerry. Same thing. The left doesn't know how to answer. Liberals don't know how to answer. And this sort of irrational discourse carries the day. When Super Tuesday happened, the polling organizations took samples in every state, and in 6 states, the Jewish sample, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, California, the Jewish sample was large enough to break out, and look at how Jewish Democrats voted. The Republican Jewish sample was too small. No, Jews nationwide are 60% Democrat and 15% Republican. And that's the way it's been for many, many years. The Jews never turned right, the way everybody says. But the Jewish right, that 15%, is much more outspoken. They don't leave the room. And the liberals don't want to get into a fight. In California, Illinois, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Obama beat Clinton among Jewish Democrats, and Jews voted for Obama at a higher rate than other whites did. In New York, Clinton wiped the floor with Obama among Jews. New York, where the largest chunk of the Orthodox Jewish community is, Obama lost the Jews. It's the only state where Obama lost the Jewish vote. Because there is this fear, and who goes to Washington and lobbies? Who speaks in the name of the Jews? And what happens when Jews read this stuff in the newspaper and say, that's not my community, I'm walking away. I'll go to shul on Yom Kippur, that's it. I'll have a Seder. Finish with this stuff. I'm not going to the next American ADL meeting. What do I need it for? I will say one last thing. It is said that in the 1930s, I think it was one day in 1935, a Jew was sitting on a subway in Brooklyn, heading home from work, reading the Jewish Daily Forward, which at the time was one of the largest newspapers in America, by the way. 250,000 readers every day. And he looks across the car, and there, sitting right opposite him, is a friend of his who's reading Der Stürmer, the Nazi newspaper from Germany. He rushes over. He says, what are you doing reading that garbage? His friend looked at him. He says, what's in your newspaper? The Jews are getting killed. The Jews are getting burned. The Jews are getting rounded up and put in prison camps in Germany. They can't get jobs in Chicago. In my newspaper, the Jews run Congress. The Jews run Hollywood. The Jews run the... It's a much more pleasant reading experience. Thank you. I promised I would talk 35 minutes, and I talked 50. So I'll keep you here for a few more minutes if anybody wants to yell at me. And you have to come to the microphone because we're taping this. You know the story about the announcement in the movie theater, will the person who lost a wallet in the lobby please form a double line outside the manager's office? Yes.
First of all, I want to thank you for coming and speaking about the issue of the Israel lobby and the problems. I think that the world, for me, a lot of people say the world is separated or there's a pre-9/11 and a post-9/11, and that's how they see history. And for me, it was definitely a pre-Walt Mearsheimer and a post-Walt Mearsheimer. So I'm very, very happy to see you here. And I think that the Forward, because of its position, has a unique responsibility to address the problem. And I'm especially happy to see you here and talking about it and taking, what's the expression? Coming to bat?
Stepping up to bat?
Stepping up to bat to this important problem. So I kind of wanted to ask everybody to applaud.
When you say it's important to talk about the problem. Do you mean the
Right.
problem of people attacking the Israel lobby or the problem of the Israel lobby?
The problem people attacking the Israel lobby. Yeah, yeah. And the
never know these days.
and the veiled anti-Semitism, which at that point, for me at least, as soon as the paper was published, what happened is that the veiled anti-Semitism sort of officially came from the margins of American society and stepped into mainstream, which I think is the main problem. And so I want to just say two things first. I wanted to make one correction as far as the Black Hatters in Israel, that there is actually a division for Black Hatters, and they serve in that division as well as carrying out the responsibilities for kashrut in the army. And the second is that just to raise something which I think is very interesting and important to think about, but when you talk about the no daylight policy, what you mentioned was that the the Israel lobby got stronger. But at the same time, what happened, at least historically, a lot of historians and academics recognized that the Cold War played its part in the drawing closer of Israel and the United States. And so there are ramifications that as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, then there are ramifications for Israel-American policy. So I wanted to ask you, on the one hand, to look at it from that perspective. And then, but those are just two side things. And my main question is, you talked about the problem. Can you talk in detail what you think are the solutions? And specifically, they come from, we know that a lot of this veiled anti-Semitism has come from the progressive liberal margins and into the mainstream. What do we do about that today? You're doing a lot by stepping up and stepping up to bat and coming here to our community and elsewhere, hopefully. What can we do?
Let me start. The question of the demography of the Orthodox in Israel. I use Black Hat or ultra-Orthodox to refer to the right wing of the Orthodox community, which generally dresses in black and white, which largely, the big dividing line is that religious Zionists who wear usually knitted yarmulkes or leather yarmulkes and wear regular civilian clothes, as it were, believe that the state of Israel was part of God's will. When Zionism was first formed 100 and something years ago, most Orthodox rabbis said it's a sin to act against God's will. God dispersed us. God will bring us back when he's ready to send the Messiah. We're in exile because of our sins, and you can't challenge God's will like that. A small number of rabbis said if God didn't want the Jews to return to Israel, he wouldn't be sending all these young socialists from Russia to form kibbutzim. They are a sign that this is God's will. It's not the end of days in the Messianic era. It would be a sin to call it the Messianic era. But it is certainly the dawn of redemption. The chief rabbinate in Israel was formed by these Zionist rabbis. And in fact, there's a prayer in our prayer books, in most American Jewish prayer books, written by the chief rabbis in 1949, saying, may God grant peace to the state of Israel, the first dawn of our redemption. That's the messianism of the settler movement, or what became the settler movement. The idea that this is God's will, that we should be here. Ultra-Orthodox Jews don't care if Israel has the West Bank or not. The Bible says you can't give back land that God gave you. But God didn't give us the West Bank in 1967. The Israeli army took it. The religious Zionists believe it was a miracle. When you see black hatters in the army, they are either rabbis who work for the chief rabbinate and are Zionist and work as chaplains in the army, but rabbis in Israel, regardless of their movement, tend to wear black and white. Or they are Lubavitchers. Chabad is the only wing of the ultra-Orthodox, the Hasidic movement, which actually regards Israel as a miracle and regards Israel, therefore, as obliged to keep the West Bank and never give it back. The black hatters that are the ultra-Orthodox who are growing at this fantastic rate are the ones who don't accept, that's why they won't serve in the army. Yes, it is true that as part of a protracted negotiation to do something about this, the government passed a law with the very grudging agreement of the chief ultra-Orthodox rabbinate as opposed to the chief rabbinate, setting up a unit in the Israeli army for ultra-Orthodox boys. It's a separate unit so they don't have to come in contact with the treif talking and thinking, the half-naked girls. As it happened, I have a nephew who's in that unit. It's not black hats. Most of it is made up. There's a handful of wayward kids who the rabbis send off to the army because they're hopeless. Most of it is made up of settlers who have become more and more devout over the years as they've become more and more alienated from the rest of Israeli society, and who therefore are being sent by their rabbis to the ultra-Orthodox unit so that they get a better Torah education during the army. It didn't work. And the rabbis in Bnei Brak and in Jerusalem are still pressuring the young men not to go into the army, even though now they can, and even though they would benefit financially. You talked about the Cold War. I always forget to read my notes because I lose my place while I'm looking out, and so that's why I go on for 50 minutes. One of the primary problems that we have now, in my belief, and I'm not alone in this, is the inflammatory role played by the Bush administration. Has gone in, you can read it in the 9/11 report, you can read it in the Iraq study group, Jim Baker and Lee Hamilton. You can read it, it's all over the place. That the Bush administration, by going in, preaching, guns blazing, ignoring the rest of the world, not building coalitions, not waiting for the UN, sending generals who are fundamentalist Christians and think Islam is a perverted religion to command units in Iraq? What are they thinking? Yes, the relationship between America and the Arab world and the rest of the world has greatly soured, and Israel, as an American protectorate, has suffered. It used to be that people got mad at America because of Israel. Now people dislike Israel because of America. And polls in Europe show this all the time. Bush is so unpopular. Bush was very, very unpopular in Europe, fantastically unpopular, before 2004. But the polls showed consistently people like America, they respect American democracy, they think Bush is off his rocker. After Bush was reelected, those polls shifted. People were telling pollsters all the time, this is like every poll in every country in Europe, it's no longer not your fault. So that is a major factor in this polarization and in the decline of Israel. Israel is identified with America. It's identified with people who, despite Israel's best thinking, pushed for a war in Iraq to benefit Israel in ways that Israel didn't want to be benefited. And now they're paying the price. Now Iran's developing a nuclear bomb and nobody's going to stop them because Iran's not afraid of anybody anymore. There's no more Saddam Hussein. Now there's Al-Qaeda in Gaza. As far as what we can do, I'm not that good at that these days. I'm pretty pessimistic. One thing is to speak out. Just make voices heard. No, Israel isn't always right. Yes, Israel has manipulated public opinion in some ways in this country. I told you about what happened with the after 93. In 1975, in 74, after Golda Meir was deposed in the wake of the Yom Kippur War, Yitzhak Rabin became prime minister for the first time. He appointed a coalition entirely of the left. For the first time, the religious had been left out. And the religious and the right were a minority. His information minister, Aharon Yariv, who was a major general in the army until just before that and was the head of military intelligence, joined up with the health minister, Victor Shemtov, who was the head of Mapam, the very left-wing party. And the two of them issued what they called the Yariv Shemtov platform, which said Israel should talk to anyone who is prepared to talk to Israel and sees negotiations as the way to solve the problem. It's a polite way of saying Israel should talk to the PLO if and when the PLO is ready to do business. It didn't get adopted by the Israeli government, but neither did they get expelled from the cabinet. They remained ministers until Rabin lost his job in 76. The Israeli ambassador in Washington at that time was orchestrating a national campaign in America. An organization had been formed in New York called Brei Ra. Mostly young rabbis, young Jewish activists, seminary students, who advocated the Ariv Shem Tov formula. Israel should talk to the PLO. Simcha Dinitz, Ambassador Dinitz, got Israeli consuls to call local federation directors and B'nai B'rith chapter presidents into his office to get those rabbis fired from their Hillel jobs, fired from their synagogues, to get signers of the Breira statement kicked off of federation boards and their gifts no longer accepted, so they were humiliated in their communities, to break Breira for advocating what two ministers in the Israeli government were saying openly. Because Israel needs American Jews, as I said, to be scared and to be pessimistic and to have an exaggerated notion of the dangers Israel can face and of the risks it can take. So yeah, we can't get manipulated by that. And we have been for 30 years. We've got to show that being pro-Israel doesn't automatically mean being a right-wing loony or believing that the Arabs have no rights there. That would be the first step. Take ads. And don't let the ads be taken over by the left, by the people who say Israel is a sinful, racist state. Differentiate. It's very lonely, it's very hard, and we're in a very bad place right now. One of the steps is to elect a Democrat, I believe. I can't say that publicly because our newspaper's a nonprofit, but Bush's policies have been terrible for Israel. Terrible, because he's allowed Israel to do whatever it wanted. He's not pushed towards negotiations. Israel needs help talking to the Palestinians. If you believe that you can't negotiate with evil, you can't be much use to Israel in making peace. Olmert says, if Israel doesn't end the occupation, Olmert said, Likudnik, lifelong. If Israel, he said this a few weeks ago, if Israel doesn't end the occupation and get out of the territories fast, it is doomed. In 20 years, Israeli Jews will be a minority of the residents of what is now under Israeli rule. And then you can either keep the Palestinians under lock and key like they do now, but it'll be a majority, and then it'll be apartheid, and then you'll see trouble. Or you have a binational state, and there's no longer a Jewish state. It's the end of Israel within 20 years. One more story. The Geneva Initiative was an outline of a peace agreement negotiated in Geneva by unofficial representatives probably 3 or 4 years ago. Teams of Israeli liberals, including some recently retired generals, and teams of PLO activists who weren't appointed by Arafat went and negotiated all of the details. They negotiated a peace treaty as a model to show their respective governments it can be done. It's this far away. At one point in the middle of the negotiations, Yossi Beilin, former Israeli Minister of Justice, known left-wing politician, and the chairman of the Israeli side, sat down with Kadora Fares, who was one of the leaders of the Palestinian side. He's considered the chief lieutenant of Marwan Barghouti, the guy in jail. He said, Kadora, he told me this story a few weeks afterwards. In 20 years, you guys are going to be the majority. Why are you doing this? Why work for 22% of your land as you see it now, when you could sit on your hands for 20 years, refuse to make a deal with us, and then it'll all be yours? Fares said, look, if we wait 20 years, we will be a majority, another 80 years of struggle, and we can probably achieve a unitary Palestinian state. But I have kids. I want them to have a life. If we can make a deal now, this is the thinking on the Palestinian side. There are some who are absolutely opposed, Hamas, which got a minority of the votes when they were elected to parliament. The Hamas split into multiple candidacies, and 55% of the vote, but 45% of the parliament. But most Palestinians believe that. I don't like it, but this is the best we're going to get. And I don't want my children growing up like this. Okay, anybody else? Have I talked you to death? Yes.
Could you, I haven't read this, the document that you referred to at the very beginning of your talk. What struck me that would be helpful was to, if these two individuals are so intelligent and brilliant and well-educated, what's the motivation for them to come out with something that you see as ridiculous? How could that be? And also say a little bit about Tony Judt, who interests me.
I have to say, first of all, I don't have a clue. I don't know anybody who knows them who has any idea what happened. They are two of the most distinguished political scientists in America. They have a quote in there from Ben-Gurion to prove that he never really wanted to compromise, and that partition, sharing, which Ben-Gurion accepted in 48, was only part of the next step toward conquering all of it. They're quoting a speech in 1937. He was talking about the first British partition plan, the Peel Commission of 1937, which gave a small area for the Jewish state. It didn't happen. But it would have been around Tel Aviv and around Haifa. That was pretty much it. And Ben-Gurion accepted it. And people went crazy. And he said, we don't want this. I don't want to share the land at all. We didn't come here to share the land. But this is the best offer we've had in 2,000 years. And if we don't embrace it now, we're crazy. That was the speech. They quoted the first half of the sentence in order to say that Ben-Gurion was against compromise. They have a line in there in which they quote the forward as calling Paul Wolfowitz the most hawkishly pro-Israel neocon in the Bush administration, in quotes. So I checked the footnote and I went back to the forward to see what we had written, where that quote was from. Did we call him that? Actually, it was a demonstration in 2002 at the height of the Intifada on the Mall in Washington, organized by a bunch of Jewish organizations. Unsurprisingly, most of the people there were Orthodox. Paul Wolfowitz was sent to speak for the administration, and he urged them to think about Palestinian suffering and Palestinian rights and the need for Israel to compromise, and he got booed by the crowd, roundly booed, Paul Wolfowitz, by the pro-Israel crowd, which our reporter said ought to end the rumors around the country that Paul Wolfowitz is somehow the most hawkishly pro-Israel. Tell me how they could do that, and I'll tell you how they could put out this paper. It is ridiculous. I asked Tony Judd afterwards, how could he defend them? And he got very uncomfortable. He said, I wasn't defending them. I was not defending them. I was defending the right to speak out and criticize Israeli activity. He grew up in England. He was the Secretary General of the Dror Labor Zionist Youth Group, went to Israel to kibbutz, came back, got a college degree, came here, got fairly disengaged in Israel except for a bunch of friends and family there. He has become disenchanted with Israel's role, as you can tell in some ways I have. He's quite critical of what Israel does, and he looks at the map now, and probably like many of us is thinking, how is Israel going to survive? And how come we're suddenly hated? Israel was supposed to protect us and be the safe place. Suddenly it's the most unsafe place for Jews in the world and endangering us. We're losing our status in this country because people are beginning to get mad at us as a group. Maybe Israel's not even good for the Jews. Well, people went nuts. He is now considered an anti-Semite all over the place. You know, he got engagements canceled because the Polish embassy is afraid of getting the Jewish community mad by letting him in the door. I asked him over there, I interviewed him after this, I said, do you think Israel's creation was a wrong thing? He said, God, no. My family's there. How could I think that? He wrote that he was wondering whether Israel could survive and whether it wouldn't be better for the Jews in the whole world if it became a binational state and just end the fighting. One article. And now he's an enemy of the Jews. And when I asked him about his role on the stage with Mearsheimer, he just said, I wasn't defending him. I said, when you get up on stages with people like him, do you think you're making your point and convincing anybody in the Jewish community to lighten up on Israel? He said, probably not. I think I'm really screwing it up. Yes?
Yeah, thank you very much. This has been very interesting. And by the way, Tony Judd has an article this week in the New York Review actually optimistic about El Mert as a technocrat and even as a corrupt human being who's interested in creating a viable economy in the world, global economy, that maybe he's going to be so pragmatic that he's actually moving from where he was when he was mayor of Jerusalem and being much more willing to see what you're talking about. So it's a good article this week. Anyway, I read somewhere, and I can't remember if it was Aretz or New York Review, but Mearsheimer and Walt, someone, and it might have been Tony Judd, had a theory that Mearsheimer and Walt are such apologists for the United States' policies that they are trying to shift the blame on this mess onto Israel, and that in fact they are not part of the liberal establishment. Mearsheimer and Walt. They are pretty much mainstream and very tied to a lot of Republican intellectuals and the American Heritage, American Enterprise Institute, where they often speak. They are not like flaming liberals. These are guys who've apologized for a lot of U.S. policies in Latin America and in the Middle East. And I don't remember who it was, had this interesting theory, which I'd like to know your opinion about, that actually they are trying to shift the blame for the Bush and the right-wing military establishment in this country's adventures around the world, from Nicaragua to Guatemala to, the School of the Americas, which is still training people to torture people right here in Georgia, and that Mearsheimer and Walter are apologists for the U.S., and they're shifting the blame to Israel. Very convenient.
Well, I think there's a certain amount of in that, in the sense that, yeah, I think a lot of Americans cannot believe what has happened. They can't believe it's our fault. Can't believe they voted for this guy. Can't believe they live in a country that would elect this guy. And something must have happened to make us all crazy. Now, it's an old story. It's interesting. When the Rosenbergs got executed in 1953, there was a whole bunch of people involved in the nuclear project who were arrested, accused, convicted, and 2 of them were executed for spying for the Soviet Union and handing over. And almost all of them were Jewish, very Jewish. They were part of the Yiddish communist movement that had its own Yiddish daily paper, pro-communist. There was not a nationwide outburst of anti-Semitism. People didn't blame the Jews. As I said, something happened after 1945 that sucked the poison out. When Jonathan Pollard was arrested in 1985 for spying for Israel, spying. Inside, he worked for the American government. He betrayed the country in a sense. Betraying, I know that's a technical word that he didn't work for an enemy in time of war, but in common parlance, there was no nationwide outburst of anti-Semitism. Now, for the first time really in American history that I can think of, the Jews are being blamed. And I think part of it is disbelief at the situation we're in. Part of it is the internet. There were people in 1953 who thought that the Jews were all a bunch of commies, and look at what the Rosenbergs did. And it's a good thing they fried it. It'll teach them Jews a lesson. But you didn't say it out loud. It was rude, and you figured you were the only person who was thinking that because you didn't know anybody else, or maybe you knew one other person, and nobody was going to admit it. But now you just click on, and you can find all of the other people who think like you do. The ADL actually did a study of this about 2 years ago, about the influence of the internet on rising extremism, because people here, you're the village idiot, but you suddenly find out there's a national association of village idiots, and you feel very good. And you're empowered, and you start speaking out. And I think we're suffering from that, the idea that you can blame the Jews. Most people don't put it that way. Although in their emails to each other, and as I say, when they're tired and it's the end of a long evening at Cooper Union, it starts coming out. Blaming Israel and its lobbyists here, whoever they are, becomes acceptable because it's in the air. I don't think Israel helps by stalling. The Israeli government is afraid to confront the settlers. They're afraid. They don't know what the army is going to do. I just heard somebody say the other day that almost half the combat officers are Orthodox now. The trauma of removing 8,000 settlers in Gaza, it took 100,000 soldiers to do it, or 30,000 soldiers. What's going to happen when they need to remove 60 or 70,000? How are they going to do it? In the land where the prophets walked, where King David's walked. How are they going to do it? So Israel is stuck in a bad guy role. Satellite TV makes. Al Jazeera has had an enormous influence. You couldn't have done that 10 years ago. The technology didn't exist. So I think in a lot of ways it's in the air. Anybody else? I don't know, that's not an entirely satisfactory answer, but it's the best I got.
Let's make this the last question.
Okay.
I've been listening, so I haven't formulated this question fully.
I'll give you an
You talked.
unformulated answer.
Okay, yeah. You talked about fundamentalism as promoting black and white thinking, and not being able to negotiate. It brings to mind the scene at the end of the movie The King of Hearts, where both sides come out around the corner and they shoot each other dead. We're seeking ways, some people are seeking ways towards peace, but there's, to win the conflict, to kill versus negotiate. I've been intrigued to see the books that have come out recently on atheism, and Sam Harris's books on Letter to Christian Nation and The End of Faith. Interesting new idea, well, not new, but ideas that are now becoming accepted. I wonder if you could speak just a little bit about how we work towards peace when we're working with such seemingly irreconcilable differences between religion, which in its more fundamental sense is not about rethinking and negotiation, versus other ways of, if religion is one of the major, why don't you answer that before, if religion is one of the major issues that we need to address.
Certainly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has become much more of a religious dispute and much less of a nationalist dispute in the last 10 or 20 years. Part of it is the drift, the tuning out by liberals. And by the way, it also happens in Italy. I've got a nephew who's an Orthodox settler in the ultra-Orthodox unit. I've got a nephew on the other side, on my side of the family, who's used to be active in Peace Now. He was an officer in the Army. He's now 30, just had his first kid, and he doesn't read the newspapers anymore. Lives outside Jerusalem. Just doesn't read the newspapers. It's hopeless. He's not involved. The American Jewish left, the people, actually, the same people who formed Brera in 1975, who formed Peace Now in 1982, are now mostly into spirituality. They're into the earth. They're not engaging the political debate anymore. And they're the ones who are actually still involved in Judaism. I don't know whether I could win an argument that it's the rightward drift of the community structures that has helped push more younger people away from affiliation, synagogue attendance, in marriage, and so on. But it's striking that it's happened over the same time period. The galloping intermarriage and so on, not that I have anything against it, and the rightward drift and the dominance by Israeli security apparatus of the American Jewish establishment. Yeah, the polarization, the religion thing is there. One of the things that is striking is that the people who know Judaism best tend to be the most adamant on the rights of only the Jews exclusively to have that whole area. Gush Emunim, the original settler movement, which still dominates the settler movement, began with the argument from the head of a yeshiva in 1967, it's a miracle. God gave us the West Bank. We didn't ask for it. We didn't want the war. God gave it to us. You cannot give back what God gives you. And there's a whole bunch of quotes from the Torah to demonstrate that you're forbidden to do that. And if we do it, they find other quotes in the Torah, you violate my law, and I will punish you. You're actually threatening Israel's existence if you give away land to non-Jews. Now, the usual argument against them by liberals and leftists is they're racist. They're an endless appetite for land. They want to dominate. They want to humiliate the Palestinians. They don't want to humiliate the Palestinians. Nobody gets what they're about. If the Talmud also has another long section in which there's an argument in the Sanhedrin. One of the rabbis says the ruling of the Sanhedrin is against God's will. The meaning of the Torah is clearly X, and you just voted Y overwhelmingly. Explain to me. And the chief rabbi then, and this is 70 CE, said, I'm sorry, we just voted and you're out of order. He says, if I am right, let God come. It was about whether a certain oven was kosher, by the way. It's really a minor point. Voice comes down from heaven and says, Rabbi Eliezer is ruling according to my will. And Rabbi Joshua says, yeah, but we just voted. You're not a member of this council. And so Rabbi Eliezer, before that, he says, if I am right, let the walls tilt in, so the walls close in. And Rabbi Joshua says, are you done yet? Rabbi Eliezer says, let the river flow backwards into this hall. And the river flows backwards. He says, we're getting impatient with your stunts. So he says, let the voice of God come down. The voice of God comes down. Rabbi Joshua says, yeah, but you gave us the Torah. It's ours now, and we decide what it means. And God said, my children have defeated me. That's in the Talmud. That's law. That is religious law. How many people who are against the settlements know that? How the religious people who aren't caught up, I mean, as I say, the ultra-Orthodox don't care about the territories because they know the Talmud, and they know about that law, and they know about the priority of human life over all other laws, and a whole bunch of other things that would argue against the settlements. But they're not going to, they print things in Yiddish because they don't like talking Hebrew, but nobody to the left of the settlers is able to make the argument. So one of the things we need to do if we're going to win the fight is understand them, sympathize with the good intentions that they bring, rather than calling them names, which is one of the poisons in politics in general, and understand what would they understand. Racism, they don't care about it. There's nothing in the Bible about racism. Sexism, domination, it's not there. But God's will, they do understand. The meaning of the Torah. The meaning of thou shalt live by them, meaning don't die by them, the laws of the Torah. They know that. We don't know how to make the arguments. There is a religious justification, and there are movements. There's a settler rabbi with a long, his payas are down to here and his beard's down to here. He's as close as you can come to ultra-Orthodox and still be a settler. He just went with a bunch of Muslim qadis and several other rabbis in the settlements to Gaza to meet with Hamas, to offer a religious deal that they would get. And they're getting somewhere. It might be that he's going to get arrested for meeting with the enemy. But he says religion can be a basis for peace. People laugh at him in the Orthodox community, and in the secular community, they go, he's just another Orthodox rabbi. So we need to get back into the Jewish people and Judaism in order to win Judaism back. And I guess we're done.